today. But I want to start with the question. And you got to be honest when I ask this question, though. How many of you in here have had the thought cross your mind that basically it could be your own voice, the voice of the enemy, but the thought, it sounds something like this: I could do better all by myself. Right? Or even sing it. But if we're being honest, the thought crosses our mind sometime. And I mean, maybe it doesn't sound exactly like that, or maybe it's not as far out as that, but you've probably thought along the lines of, if I were in charge, things would be different. If I was running the show, it would be like this, or it would be like that. Here's the hard truth tonight. Sometimes we forget our place with God, and He has to remind us. Sometimes we get in our head and in our heart that we know better than God, or that, God, you should have done it 2 weeks ago, or God, this should have happened a long time ago, and then I would have avoided all of this. We forget our place with God, and God's so faithful to try and remind us. And when God reminds us, it's not this bad thing that God is doing. It's actually good for the mind for you and I to know our place with God, because then we know God's place. In fact, it's this very thing. It's disregarding our place, our standing before God. I'm not talking about being a child of the King. That's a good thing, and I love to talk about that. But I'm talking about in humility, knowing your place before God. That's the very thing that was disregarded that got Satan in trouble. He forgot his place. So I want to preach a message tonight I've entitled, Know Your Place. Know your place. We're going to be in Job chapter 40 tonight. But to better appreciate what God is trying to bring out in this conversation, you have to understand the depths that God took to make his point. So you have Job, and you know the story. All of these bad things happened to Job, and God allowed them to happen. In fact, Satan came to him, and God gave him the green light. But Job had these friends, and these friends were in his ear saying things that weren't necessarily sinful things, but they weren't the right things. And so at some point, God asked Job a question, verse 2 of Job chapter 38. God says, who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? In other words, God is saying, listen, you, Job, and your friend are talking out the side of your neck right now. You don't know what you're talking about. And again, if we're being honest, oftentimes that's you and I with things relating to God or relating to the situation at hand. We speak about things that we know nothing of. Words without knowledge. Listen to what God does in Job. I'm not going to read it all, but chapter 38 and 39. Listen to what God says to Job. He says, where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? That's a mic drop. That's enough said. It's like, okay, you're right, God. But then he goes on. He says, to what were the foundations of the world fastened on? He's asking Job. He said, or who laid the cornerstone for the foundation of the world? Then he continues, have you ever commanded the morning to appear? He said, who has put wisdom in the mind? I wish I could do that sometime for people. He says, who has given understanding to the heart? And then he asks him some things about nature. He says, does the hawk fly by your wisdom? Did you design those wings? The aerodynamics? He says, does the eagle mount up at your command? But then after he goes on for 2 chapters, checking Job, he asked a very direct question to drive home his point. This is God speaking. Job 40, this is our scripture, verse 2. He says, do you still want to argue with the Almighty? You're God's critic, but do you have the answers? Know your place. Let's dig in. I feel bad for Job just thinking about that conversation. Can you imagine God sitting you down and just rumbling all these questions, just giving them to you? Where were you? What about this? How about that? And then to end with that question, like, do you still want to argue with me, the Almighty? Like, no, not really. I mean, I was done at chapter 38, verse 1. But then he tells him, he says, you're God's critic. You're my critic. You're the critic of the Almighty, but do you have the answers? Know your place. Let's talk first about the argument. How many know what the point of an argument is? The point of an argument is when you are trying to persuade the other person about what you're saying. An argument is two opposing views. That's the nature of an argument. But how many of you have ever tried to argue with God? Well, I wouldn't dare do that. But you reason with God. You try and justify why you've done what you've done. Well, if they wouldn't have did that, I wouldn't have got mad. And you're arguing with God. Because God said, this is the way it is. And you're like, no, God, you don't understand my reasons. You're trying to persuade God. Or what about trying to make God understand how your plans are better than his? I would never do that. He's sovereign. He knows. But you say, God says, hey, I want you to do this. No, God, I'm going to wait because if I do it right now, it's going to appear a certain way and it might be this way. You're arguing with God. You're trying to persuade him. But really, arguing with God is dealing with the issue of control. And some of us struggle with the issue of control. You want to control other people so bad that you're willing to have an argument with the ice cream man because his music is too loud, he didn't have your favorite ice cream. You want control. And you can laugh and you can say it's not you, but that's the issue. You want to control people and you want to control circumstances. But I hate to be the bearer of bad news. The truth is, number one, you're not in charge. You might know that, but you don't always act like that. You're not in charge. Number two, everything doesn't have to make sense to you. God, you're in control. God, you're the one that I pray to. God, you're the one that I follow. But it better make sense. How about thinking of things like this? If you appeal to God's authority, if you say, I'm going to pray and ask God to help me in this situation or do this and that, if you appeal to God's authority, then try living under his authority. Try believing his say-so. No arguing. Ecclesiastes 6:10 says, whatever one is, he has been named already. For it is known that he is man and he cannot contend, or the word there is argue, with him who is mightier than he. God is in control. Period. In our text, Job knew better. But just like you and I, Job got out of pocket just for a minute and he forgot his place. Because earlier in the book, if you read, Job says in chapter 9, he says, if one wished to contend with him, he could not answer him one time out of 1,000. So Job gets it. He understands that God is sovereign. He's in control. But just for a second, he forgot his place. See, to argue with God, it's actually a complete waste of time and a waste of effort. It's like talking just to hear yourself talk. And I know some people like to do that. But with God, it's a waste of time. It's like trying to make a point when the matter is already decided. Have you ever been somewhere, I'm thinking of like a courtroom, and the judge is the God in the courtroom, okay? When the judge makes their decision, that's it. But I've been in courtrooms where People are still trying to convince the judge. He's given the sentence. He's already spoken. They're like, nah, judge, you don't know. This is what really happened. Or judge, you should have did this. That's what it's like when we argue with God. It's wasted time and effort. It's like trying to empty the ocean using a Dixie cup, little cups. And you're just, I'm going to empty this whole ocean. I understand the whole earth is 70% water, but I'm going to empty it all out with my Dixie cup. You're wasting time. Romans 9:20 says, who are you, a mere human being, to argue with God? Should the thing that was created say to the one who created it, why have you made me like this? See, in an argument, you think you're right. Otherwise, you wouldn't be trying to persuade the other person. Yet we do that with God. But when we do that, when we're arguing with God, we're automatically proving that we think we know better. Isaiah 40:14 says, with whom did God take counsel? And who instructed him and taught him in the path of justice? Who taught him knowledge and showed him the way of understanding? You got to know your place. I feel like some of you are surprised that the Bible says this and calls us out on this. Like, what? What happened to the meek and mild Jesus? He understands. I should be able to talk to God. I should be able to yell at God, and I should be able to do that. That's fine. You can. Just understand there's consequences. I tell people often that come with questions about things. Listen, I'm an open book. You can ask me whatever you want. I'm not a shy person. We can talk about whatever you want. But if you're going to ask me a question, you have to be able to handle the answer. Let's talk quickly about the Almighty. Our scripture says, do you still want to argue with the Almighty? You're God's critic, but do you have the answers? You know, sometimes God has to remind us of our limitations because we get too comfortable with our understanding. No, but I've been around a while. I know this book. I understand how this goes. I got it. God says, yeah, but you have limitations. Colossians 1:16. For by him all things were created that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers, all things were created through him and for him. You notice it doesn't have anybody else's name in there. It doesn't say by him and Thomas, or by him and, it's just God. God is the one with infinite wisdom, not only to design and configure, but infinite power to execute and accomplish. Let that sink in. Everything doesn't have to make sense to you. You are not in charge. Truth is, you can have a meaningful life without being in control and knowing everything. That should be like a weight off. Like, okay, I don't have to control that person. I don't have to be in control of that situation. I don't have to know it all. Thank God. You need to know your place. You know, God often has to put us in our place because we act like we outgrow our dependence on him. I've got this job. I've been doing it for a while now. I know how to make this money. I know how it works. I've outgrown the simple things. I've outgrown that every morning. I said, once you give me that job, God, every morning I'm going to hit my knees in prayer and just thank you for it. But now that I've got it, God, you know I'm tired. I worked a double shift. I'll get with you this evening, God. God has to put us in our place again. Sometimes God has to put us in our place because we begin to fill ourselves. We incorrectly think that, you know what, I've got all this in place now. I'm the master of these resources. And you get it twisted. I've told you before how Michelle, my wife, would say to her, actually she does it now with the little ones. She asks them, who's the boss? We can be in public and she's asking them, who's the boss? And I bet people are looking like, this kid is 5. You're asking him, who's the boss? guarantee you, it'll never be an issue in my home when the kids know who's in charge and who's not in charge. I believe God has to do that with us oftentimes. Our role before God is dependent children. That's our place. But again, in our text, Job, he was caught up in the thinking that what he was going through was all about him. You ever been there? God, this happened to me, and then this happened, and then while I was dealing with that, something else happened over here, and then this on top of that, and this. As if it's all about you. When actually, in reality, all that Job was going through, God had much bigger plans. There were much bigger things at stake because he's the almighty ruler and sustainer. Sometimes we forget our place and we think the world revolves around us. How many remember the story in Daniel chapter 9? It was King Nebuchadnezzar. He was having dreams. King Nebuchadnezzar was super powerful at the time. He was the man. But he was having these dreams and he couldn't understand. So he goes to Daniel. Daniel was given a gift. He interprets the dreams for King Nebuchadnezzar. And in Daniel, he says, he interprets the dream. He says, "Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. And he changes the times and the seasons. He removes kings and raises up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding." You're like, well, that's great. He interpreted a dream. Well, then you're missing it. He's interpreting this dream to probably the most, if not one of the most powerful men in the world at that time. And he's reinforcing the fact that although you're powerful, God's in control. Listen to it again. Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. God changes the times and the season. God removes kings and raises up kings. God gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. The Almighty controls nature. The Almighty controls the affairs of men. The Almighty controls everything. We say, you know what, I don't quite understand the situation. Maybe not. He's almighty. Isaiah 25. "O Lord, you are my God. I will exalt you. I will give thanks to your name, for you have worked wonders. Plans formed long ago with perfect faithfulness." He's the Almighty. Our job is to know our place. Let me close tonight. I want to talk about the answer. Listen, it's in trusting God that we become wise. It's in trusting God. It's great to know the scriptures. It's great to learn and to study. We're commanded to do these things, but it's in trusting God that we become wise. After the awesome explanation that God has given Job, he asks him the final question in Job 42. He says, "Do you still want to argue with the Almighty? You're God's critic, but do you have the answers?" That's what everybody wants, the answers. The truth is, we don't have the answers. You realize that where you look as a result of suffering reveals so much about you. You know, in fact, that's why oftentimes in training, special forces and things like that, they push you to your limit, because that's when you see, oh, that's what they're made of. Oh, that's what came out of them. This entire transaction with God and Job, it was because of the reality of what Job was going through. It was because Job was going through some things that he didn't like, and he was suffering. The question we should often ask ourselves are, do we tolerate the temporary lie, or are our eyes on forever? Do we get stuck in the moment? I know we talk about this a lot, but do we get stuck in the here and now and are unable to see beyond what's going on because of what's going on? See, it's so easy to get caught up in the current happenings and forget, or should I say, have no regard for what God is after. But I'm going through this, God. This is hard right now. I don't have the money to do what I want to do, God. Things aren't turning out the way I think they should. And we forget what God is after. We forget the promise of God working all things together for our good. Think about it like this. You want to change the heart of somebody? Maybe they don't like you, or you think they don't like you, or you want to change a situation, and you're asking for God's intervention. Remind yourself, God has the answer, and it may come through circumstances that He performs, or it may come through circumstances that He permits, but God has the answers for that. What about God shaping in your life? You say you've given your life to Jesus, but God begins to get in there and mold and to do some things, and you're like, I don't like that. You need to remind yourself that God has the answer, and perhaps what you don't understand in the moment will one day be revealed as divine wisdom. Because God has the answers. You need to remind yourself, and I'm closing. Followers of Jesus, we live in both worlds, but we're invested in one. We live in the earth, right? But we're kingdom citizens. If you invest all of your life here in the here and now and what's seen and only what you understand, you're going to be shaken when this world is shaken. And listen, it's beginning even now. But if you've invested your life in the other world, then you'll stand. See, God challenged Job for answers. Oh, Job, you forgot your place. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? So what were the foundations of the earth fastened to? Or who laid the cornerstone for the foundation? Have you ever commanded the morning to appear? Who has put wisdom in the mind, or who's given understanding to the heart? Does the hawk fly by your wisdom? Does the eagle mount up at your command? Not one answer could be answered by Job, or anybody for that matter. You're like, well, why would God do that? Why can't God just tell me, shut up, sit down, I'm God? Well, probably because you get offended. So instead, in great mercy and care, God brings Job through all of these questions that he can't answer because he's after something. It's in trusting God that we become wise. God, I don't know. God, I don't have the answers. But you're God and you know, and if I trust you, listen, never forget that God is able. Never forget that God is able. Radical conversions that we want to see, remind yourself of yourself. Restoration that we desperately need in areas of our lives, perhaps. That's God's place to bring that about. Our place is to labor toward those ends. Our place is to create an atmosphere where the Spirit of God has liberty to move. God, I want you to save souls. God, I want people come in, they can be captivated by the Spirit of God. They can feel the conviction of sin and be saved, just like I was. God said, yeah, you're right. That's my place. Your place is to create an environment for that to happen. Spreading the message that hope and breakthrough are available, that's our place. No, I believe perhaps the greatest mistake made by man is not knowing our place in relation to God. well, I can do this by myself. I don't need God. I understand this, or I'll figure it out. I'm talking about even in purpose in life, not just circumstances. Listen, no one who has opposed God has ever won. Not one. God, you should have did it like this. Man, I wish things would have. No one has ever opposed God and won. Do you still want to argue with the Almighty? Oh, you're God's critic, but do you have the answers? Interesting, Job came to his senses in verse 4 of Job chapter 40. He said, I am nothing. How could I ever find the answers? I'll cover my mouth with my hand. Listen, you love doctrine? That's good doctrine. Sometimes we just need to shut up before God. Sometimes we need to just stop, turn it off, and say, okay, you're God and I'm not. That's it. This is scripture. Job said, I am nothing. You should never tell yourself that. You need to have more respect for yourself. You need to know your place. Know your place. In all of life, in every circumstance, Jesus is the answer. Well, I got money issues. I got relationship issues. Jesus is the answer. But you will only ever know that if you know your place. Job knew his place. And this is why Job was able to say, the Lord gave and the Job knew his place. That's why he was able to say, though he slay me, yet I will trust him. He's God. I believe, with all of my heart, I believe God sits like in Jeremiah 18, and he's saying to his people, the house of Israel, that's us. He's saying to his people, can I not do with you as this potter? Look, as the clay is in the potter's hand, so are you in my hand, O house of Israel. We have to know our place, and God will help us. Let's bow our heads tonight.